Good morning and good afternoon. Welcome to the Weekend Wellness Hour. Today, we are going to explore yoga and specifically the psychology of yoga with yoga instructor and wellness coach, Emily Chhatriwalla. And she's joining us today and I'm really excited to have her. Thank you so much for coming on your Saturday and sharing with us.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, so you have a 500 hour plus certification in yoga and you've done some advanced training. And I'm curious, how did you get into this field? Because you now help women, especially nurses and people in healthcare who are burnt out. But a lot of what you have and your knowledge can apply to all of us. So I'm curious, how did you get into this?
How did I get into the field of yoga?
Yeah.
That's a great question. I love starting with that. I actually took my first yoga class as college credit. So many years ago, I was majoring in nutrition. Dietetics was the name of my major. And so, of course, I was naturally health conscious and curious about all different forms of exercise. And I thought I really wanted to know what yoga was all about. So I took a course for credit. And it was wonderful because we had this really dedicated instructor who was willing to tolerate the personality mix of college students who are taking yoga for credit. But everyone who was taking the class, like within the first, session, everyone just really dropped in and was sort of just enamored with this woman and her teaching style. And we ended up learning so much and did a lot over the course of that semester that I took that yoga class. And from there, of course, I loved yoga, but I did sort of have like a in and out relationship with it. I always considered myself, spiritual and to subscribe to the teachings of yoga, but I wasn't always practicing in a studio. So many years went by, and after I had children was when I really came back to the practice in a really big way because I needed it for the stress relief. And I was able to find a studio that it worked with my schedule and they had childcare. And so it's kind of like they say in yoga that you have to find the right teacher and the right class for it to really click. And so I had had many teachers and classes that I had loved before, but it was when, after I had children that I really needed the help with it, that I became a very dedicated practitioner. And then eventually did my teacher's training in 2015.
Well, that's wonderful. And then with your teacher's training, you chose to specialize a little bit more or seek additional coursework in yoga psychology. Is that correct? In trauma?
Yes, correct. So the first level of training is called a 200 hour for a yoga teacher. And after you have your 200-hour certification, you can teach in a studio to groups or one-on-one. And then if you want to further your studies, you can take another yoga teacher's training, which is 300 more hours. And in that 300 hours, you can choose to specialize, or you can choose a program that focuses on a lot of different things. Some programs really focus on the physical aspect of yoga, like anatomy and really understanding how our muscles work and how the poses benefit the physical body. And, some focus more on breath work or more on the spiritual practice. And the path that I chose focuses on the psychology of yoga, because yoga really is a psychology. One of the phrases about yoga is that yoga is a journey of the self, through the self, to the self. And that is pretty much what psychology is. It's uncovering, the true self. And so yoga is, even if you didn't call it yoga psychology, if you're a longtime practitioner of yoga, you're doing that journey, you're doing that psychological journey. And so the training that I took part in just really focused on that. It focused on what does that look like and how do we frame that up for students so that they can take that journey to really focus on the psyche rather than the physical. The physical is always included, but it's just more of a focus on the psychological benefits.
Right. And so, because nowadays when we think of yoga, a lot of people do it for calming themselves down or getting more mobile or more flexible. But I've listened to many podcasts, many speakers, and they talk about how yoga in the ancient world looks very differently than what we do now in a class that looks like exercise. But what you're talking about, it sounds like you're bringing some of the ancient wisdom and the spiritual and mental and emotional part into the physical practice.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Amy. It is.
Right.
It's a blending of Eastern and Western
Mhm.
perspectives on the self, the body, and healing.
Right. And so now this is different than we would think of like traditional psychology, where you're going to see a therapist to get some kind of training and help on your mental and emotional traumas or stressors, stuff like that, correct?
Hmm. Yeah, for sure. I am a coach, and so we do talk a lot about mindset, but I am not a psychologist, so I don't diagnose or prescribe or anything like that. One of the things that I like to talk about and to help explain the difference is that a lot of the times the traumas that we've endured live in the body. And so one of the ways of accessing them is to talk about it in
Mhm.
therapy, or there's all different forms of therapy. But another way is to energetically move that through the body and out of the body. And so bringing the two together really, a lot of the clients that I work with are in therapy. And then this is
Mhm.
sort of like um, a support therapy to the psychotherapy. And the two just really work together synergistically.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So now when you're approaching, let's say, a client, and or you're using your knowledge of psychology, yoga psychology in your practice, what
Mhm.
does that look like in terms of, do you work with people individually, in a group? What does that look like?
Yeah. So what it looks like, bringing just to first address your question of what bringing in those concepts. So it, one of the things that I learned in my yoga psychology training is how to track someone's energy and their response.
Mhm.
It's very subtle. As you're speaking about things, there are little ways of noticing that it's either people are guarding or they're relaxing more into it. So it's being very in tune to the client's experience and then adjusting that, and also being very in tune to not only the client's experience but what we might be experiencing
Okay.
alongside them, and keeping those two separate and not sort of going into that experience with them, remaining the um, unbiased observer and just helping
Mhm.
them move through those things. I tend to work with clients one-on-one in person,
Okay.
but I do also have group programs where
Mhm.
some of the work is done independently, and then we come together in group for coaching sessions.
Okay. So do they go through a yoga routine when they're working with you one on one, or is it more talking and coaching? What does that look like?
It's a blend of the two.
Mhm.
There's a little bit of coaching where we talk about what's coming up for them, what they're working through, and what
Mhm.
we can do in the classroom to help them work through that. And then we do a yoga routine. Yeah. And so the yoga routine is some movement, like the poses you would typically see in a studio, but we
Okay.
do a lot more breath work and meditation, because
Okay.
breath is really effective for moving energy through, as you know, and also
Mhm.
helping to calm down the nervous system. So most people who are coming to see me are pretty revved up. They've been in fight or flight for
Yeah.
quite a while. And so the breath really helps to bring them into their body so that we can establish a sense of safety so that the
Mhm.
movement comes more easily.
That's great. So if someone were to come to you, it's a personal session, and this, can they do it virtually as well? I know you said you do it pretty
Mhm.
much in person, but can you do this virtually with people
Yeah,
who are interested?
yep, definitely can do. And I have before. Um, it we just do it over Zoom. We do the exact same
Mhm.
things together over Zoom,
Okay.
and it works wonderfully.
That's wonderful. And so how do you structure the program in terms of, if someone has, they show up as fight or flight, they're ramped up and revved up, how do you structure it to try to calm them down? Do you have some portion of it, is, you said you talked to them a little bit, but is it working on the mental, emotional, and physical? Do you go through their medical history as well? Or, because there's a lot that goes into,
Mhm.
obviously, when someone shows up and you've never met them before, trying to figure out all the pieces that make up their
Mhm.
personal puzzle sometimes can be a little bit hard. So how do you approach that?
Yeah, absolutely. I have a background in healthcare. I was a nutrition support dietitian for 15 years before I became a yoga teacher. And so I'm practiced in, taking a full history from someone. I find that when it comes to the work that I do with my clients, we don't need to take, I don't need to know every single thing about their past. Of course, I need to know about any injuries or physical limitations that would keep them from moving comfortably through any poses that we're doing. I also don't need to know the specifics of their trauma. Just knowing that it's something they're working through, that's one of the beauties of healing trauma, is that you don't need to relive the experience. You simply work with the emotions and the sensations that are coming up in your body and help to calm them. What was the second part of your question? You were asking
just kind of how you approach a new client
when they
someone
come in fight or flight.
Someone comes in.
Yeah, so I typically in yoga, one of the core teachings is to meet students where they are. So whatever they're coming in with that day, if they're coming in very up and very, you can notice that people are moving quickly or talking fast, we work with that energy. We just go right into moving with that energy to help, basically to help them process that, to help them move through that. And then we start to come down. So it's different. Some people come in and they are burnt out and they're depressed and they're low energy. So we start low, we start calm by sitting and breathing and just being present with the body, and then start to take it up into movement. And other people are just really up and fast moving. So we start there and we bring it down.
Yeah.
Because it's all with the goal of like finding that place of balance, of equilibrium, so that they aren't too down or too up when they leave the classroom.
Oh, that's great. And it's great because yes, with trauma, obviously, well, sometimes we don't even realize that we don't need to go through all the details. We can just move past it. So it's great to hear that part of that trauma training can go into helping them free up their body. There's a great book out there called The Body Keeps a Score. Have you read that? Because that one talks about yoga quite a bit for helping people through trauma.
Yeah.
It's a great one.
And one of the ways that yoga is really helpful is that it provides people choice. So when you asked about how I approach, there is always consent. There is always asking, is it okay to do this next? Is it okay if we do this? What do you want to avoid? So that they always feel like they have a sense of control in what's happening. Sometimes if you enter a group yoga class or any group movement class, you're doing what the class is doing. You're just following, you fall in line. And so one of the aspects of a trauma-informed yoga practice is that you're always providing choice, always providing choice. So over and over, I will say, I invite you to do this. If that doesn't work for you, here's another option. If you don't want to do any of it, don't do any of it. So it's just always letting people know that they're in charge. They have, individual agency in it.
And can you dive into a little bit about mindset and how you work with people as they're going through this process? Like, what are some of the key points or strategies?
When it comes to mindset, a lot of times it's just simply bringing awareness to what people are thinking about themselves and what their limits are and what they can or can't have. So the mindset work that we do is really conversational. It's just asking people, what are your limits? What are your challenges right now? And what would be your vision for if you could overcome these challenges? What would that look like? And a lot of times that uncovers for people, when they start talking about what they really want, they're like, well, I couldn't have that. Well, why couldn't you have that? And so we just explore, well, why? Why would you think, who gave you that message? And it can be really freeing for people to realize like, oh, wait, I can have what I want. I do have the ability to, create the reality that I want. And I'm just their guide and helping them make that come to life.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And as you go through that process with them and changing their mindset, do you see a difference in how their body's moving and some of the positions they can perform?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It's pretty profound. I'm right now working with a 6-week program, which is going to turn into a 12-week program, but I'm working primarily with nurses now. The nurses who come in on day 1 versus at the end of that 6, sometimes it's more like 8 weeks. It's just the way that they hold themselves when they walk in is remarkable. Some people's postures like come in sort of sunken.
Mhm.
and their chin is down, their gaze is down. They are talking in a lower voice, and then at the end they're sitting up tall. They're speaking with confidence and clarity, because
Mhm.
what we really work on is getting to know like your true self a little bit
Mhm.
better. And so when people know themselves and what they want, they just show up more confidently.
Mhm.
um, in terms of like actual yoga poses, yes, of course, I think that even if we weren't doing the mindset work, once people get accustomed to yoga poses, they um, they improve in them so quickly. And I think a lot of people don't know that about yoga, especially if they don't have a past being, really active, like either in sports or different exercise, or if they don't consider themselves to be very flexible, they might feel intimidated, thinking that if
Mhm.
they go to yoga, oh, it would take forever to like see any benefit. But it's actually happens so rapidly for beginners. It's sort of like exponential.
Yeah.
And then it
Yeah.
kind of plateaus off. So it's a very rewarding practice, because you can become proficient in the poses so quickly.
All right. And so if someone is struggling, like let's say someone's having a really hard day, how would you approach that differently? Do you shift the yoga poses so it's a little bit more calming pose versus maybe more of an athletic and an energizing pose? I imagine there's
Yes.
part of that as well.
Yep, definitely.
Yeah.
Yep. And it's also a proximity to the ground. So if someone is feeling very activated, or having trouble concentrating, we will do things to physically get closer to the ground. Being in that lower position just helps to calm everything. And if it's somebody is feeling really down, I said before that we start, with the energy they come in with,
Mm.
but we move toward like bringing them up,
Okay.
if that makes sense,
Yeah, it
physically,
does. Right.
literally.
In all ways, all the senses and stuff. Okay.
Exactly.
Well, that's great because I mean, obviously, we want people to transform into something where they feel free. They feel free in their body, their mind, their spirit, all of that. So, as people are going through this, how long does it take to go through a session? And then how often?
Our sessions are typically about an hour to an hour and 15 minutes,
Mhm.
and we aim to do a session every week. And it's typically within about 4 weeks that I start to see shifts in the way that they are showing up. And it's by the end of the 6 weeks that they are feeling a big difference as well. That being said, at the end of the 6 weeks, in order for the practices to become part of their daily life, we need more time. You need
Mhm.
more time practicing to really make something a new habit. So that's why the program is growing into a 12-week program.
That makes sense. And besides their one-on-one time with you, 1 hour a week or hour and 15 minutes a week, do they have daily practices that they implement into their routine to kind of solidify their shift and transformations?
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely. We practice a lot of different techniques: movement, meditation, breath work, visualization. And so as we're practicing all of these, I ask them to just keep mental note of what really resonates with them and what gave them the most noticeable benefits. And then I help them to make that an accessible part of their daily life, so they can fit in these small little snippets of self-care into a busy day, so that they can, you know, um, continue to care for themselves, and sort of charge up their battery on a daily basis. So we work on making sure that it's something they can do at home.
Mhm. And when
Yeah.
you're combining kind of breath work, meditation, and visualization, do you do them as separate individual practices? Do you combine them together?
That's a great question. They typically they kind of come consecutively. We'll start with breath, because that is so effective. We'll start with breath, and then typically it's breath, then movement, then we come down for meditation or visualization.
Okay.
Um, they can be combined. Sometimes it just depends kind of on the
Mhm.
day and what the
Yeah.
client needs, but
Mhm.
typically it comes in that order.
Okay. Now, if
Yeah.
someone is going through a bit more trauma and they need to, or they're burned out, they need to come down from their stressors, do you typically start with them in an individualized session and then graduate them to more of a group session, or do people just stay in one lane and the other?
Yeah, good question. Every anytime I start working with a client, it always starts with a one-on-one coaching call.
Okay.
So we really get to know each other, and I get to know what their needs are and what their desires are, and we choose a path from there. So some clients really only want to stick with one-on-one, and some like the community feeling of a group, and it's totally up to them.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's good. I mean, it's great people have the option and they can shift. So, what are some of the other kind of conditions or people that would benefit from this? And maybe some people that, it's kind of contraindicated and they say, okay, you're not at that point where you can really benefit.
Yeah, I'd say that yoga can benefit anyone who is open to the teachings of yoga. It can benefit. There are plenty of people who have trauma in their past. I work primarily with healthcare workers, mostly nurses. So they may have, we all have experienced some level of trauma in our life. And so everyone has these traumas from their past. And then nurses specifically have experienced a huge trauma with the pandemic. And so we're working with that. So anybody who has, sorry, let me rephrase this. Anybody who is currently working through trauma would be a great candidate for one of my programs, because it's a complementary therapy to whatever else they are seeking out. So if they're doing individual psychotherapy, or if they're on antidepressants or anti-anxiety meds, this is just another complementary therapy in sort of the healthcare team is how I look at it.
Right. And if, let's say, they're not as physically fit and they're maybe more of a newbie towards fitness and movement, is that still an okay, is that
Yeah,
okay for them
absolutely.
to join in and still
Yep.
learn? Because we can all at least get moving a little bit more.
Totally. I take anybody with any physical abilities or limitations, because there are always practices within yoga that you can do. Even movement for someone who hasn't moved in a long time, there are still plenty of movements that are accessible and safe and beneficial.
All right, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really powerful. And when you're working with people, I know there's a history to yoga. It's not always studied, but is that something you bring in, or most people not really interested in learning kind of the history of yoga?
I do tend to weave it in because it's so interesting to me. So when we are exploring mantra, I tend to talk about sort of the history of bhakti yoga, which is the yoga of devotion, and primarily the way that a bhakti yoga practitioner practices is through mantra and chanting. And so I like to explain that piece of the yoga history to people. Most people are interested in it. I rarely will I go into the whole sordid history of yoga and how it started way back thousands of years ago. But I will, drop in little snippets here and there if the student or the client seems interested. Yeah.
Okay. And then do you do different types of yoga practices with your clients, or do you stick with one?
Yeah, that's a great question. We do all different types. So my training is primarily in vinyasa yoga, which is just piecing together yoga into a flowing sort of sequence. So vinyasa is sometimes thought of as like advanced, the more challenging form of yoga, but basically it's any intentional flowing. I mean, this can be debated what vinyasa really means, but in our modern American way of doing yoga, vinyasa typically denotes that you're flowing through poses. And so we will do plenty of that, but we also do a lot of restorative yoga, which is yoga that you use a lot of props and you're completely supported and you're focusing on doing nothing but relaxing for several minutes at a time in different poses. So there's no strain, there's no effort. It's purely a yoga of receiving, and it's very beneficial, and it's also something that clients love to do.
Okay.
So those are the two primary ones. Sometimes there's some yin in there, sometimes more balance work, but those are the primary ones.
Okay. And probably not too much of the Bikram yoga, where Sure.
Yeah, I do never heat up the room or flow through the
Okay.
same sequence over and over.
Yeah, excuse me. Yeah, they're already stressed enough. They probably don't need that additional layer of let's challenge your nervous system by heating you up in really
Yeah.
high
Some people
levels.
like the heat. It's
Yeah.
really therapeutic for them. It's not what I offer.
Yeah, no, I can understand that. So this has been great. Is there anything else you'd like to share about kind of what we've been talking about with the psychology of yoga, mindset, anything at all that we didn't cover?
I think the only other thing I wanted to share is that if a yoga practice is something that you've been considering and you're not sure how to get started, I would encourage you to find a basic yoga class either at a studio or a gym or online and just give it a try. Some people are like, "Oh, I've always been meaning to do yoga." And so I, just want to encourage anyone who's watching, if you're in that camp, I would say just do it. Like, find a class. There's tons online. You can call me. I'm sure you'll put my contact information there.
Mhm.
Just do it. Just give it a try, because I think that you'll be so glad that you did.
Oh, that's great. We really appreciate it. And how can people reach you?
Yeah, I have a website. The name of
Mhm.
my business is Emily Chhatriwalla Yoga.
Okay.
So just website of the same name, emilychhatriwalla.com. And I have a private Facebook group for nurses. It's similar
Okay.
to the group where you'll be posting this,
Mhm.
where nurses can come in and receive. I record classes and I have teachings, and there's tons of resources in that group for them. So that's
Mhm.
the name of that group is Final Shift. So if you're a
Final
nurse
shift?
watching,
Okay.
Final Shift, if you're a nurse watching, you can just search that on Facebook and join my group. I'd love to have you.
Okay. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, taking time out of your Saturday. Really appreciate you coming on and just sharing. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here, Amy.
No, wonderful. And thank you all for joining us today. Have a great rest of your weekend. Please check out Emily's website, Emily Catherine Yoga. That's Kathryn, right? Catherine?
Yep.
Okay, wonderful. Please check her out and have a great rest of your week. Take care. See you next week. Bye now.
Bye, everybody.